Today's scripture reading is from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, chapter 25, verses 19 through 34. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife, because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger."
When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. This is God's word.
Good morning. Are you someone who looks for the moral in the story when you're watching a movie or reading a book? Or are you trying to figure out what's this about? If, I don't know, if you're a baseball player and you play for the Rangers, the moral of the story might be don't make Jose Altuve mad, right? Maybe that's the don't wake up the Astros is the moral of the story. But in all seriousness, is there some compulsion? I found this to be pretty different for different people. Some people, they're always looking for an application, a moral to the story, and some people are maybe comfortable, maybe too comfortable with just sort of existing, not sure if there is a moral. This is a passage, if I'm going to be bold, I'm going to give you a hot take. I don't know that it has a moral to the story the way we normally expect. A good guy, a bad guy, good decisions, bad decisions. If anything, this is a pretty honest and unflinching portrayal of brokenness at every level of the family unit. It's one of the things, if I'm going to just go out the gate here with a bit of an apologetic, a bit of a defense of why I find the Bible so compelling, it's moments like these where the writer of this story is so unafraid to show us how the heroes, the people that shape our story of faith in the Bible, are just so broken. It doesn't really conform to the expectations of myth and ancient Near Eastern stories that sometimes we read. Now, of course, these are also complex stories in their own right, but when you read the Bible, you will find over and over again that the people that are held up in the New Testament often as paragons of faith, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, the list goes on. When we read their stories, you may have come across these moments where you go, man, they made some really questionable decisions. In this story, there are some questionable decisions that start at the very top with Isaac and Rebekah's relationship and run all the way down. And that's the reason I say that sometimes reading the Bible, when you're looking for the moral to the story, can be frustrating. One of my favorite comedians is a guy named Norm Macdonald. Maybe you've heard of him. He's amazing. We have one fan at least. And one of the things he does that I think is genius is he tells intentionally bad punchlines to his jokes. He tells a long joke. There's a famous one he told to Conan O'Brien one time. It's called the moth joke. You can look it up, where he tells a 2-minute story about a moth that goes to see a podiatrist and describes how depressed he is in his life. And he goes through every single detail. And the podiatrist says, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Moth, but it sounds like you need to see a psychiatrist. Why'd you come see me?" And the moth says, Because the light was on. That's the entire joke. It was 2 minutes. Conan O'Brien says, "You're a sick man." That's his response, right? I wonder if sometimes you feel that way with the Bible, that you read a story and you get to the end and you go, what? What am I supposed to do with it? Because the light was on? That experience, if I can put it in a nutshell, is exactly what we're talking about in this sermon series. It's wrestling with God. All through the fall, we're examining these stories in Genesis, these formative foundational stories about faith, and showing how in each and every episode is this great wrestling with God. And if there is no moral to this story, if you buy my hot take, at least not in the traditional sense, then what are we doing talking about it? Well, bear with me. Because I think that the story is far more about God than it is about Jacob and Esau. One of the disservices that we do sometimes when we read the Bible and we read stories in Genesis is we say, oh, that's the episode with Abraham and Isaac, or Jacob and Esau, or Abraham and Sarah, David and Bathsheba. We read these stories and we even summarize them and we teach them sometimes to our children in the human dynamics of what they are. That's David and Goliath. But the story of Scripture is always about what God is doing with Jacob and Esau. And that will be the moral in the end. So 3 things this morning as we examine this foundational origin story of this character Jacob and his brother Esau. First is the long view. The second is the wrong view. And the third is the view from the cross. The long view, the wrong view, the view from the cross. This passage begins with something of a long view. It tells us a little bit about how we arrived at this moment. We've been following the story of Abraham. If you were here last week, we heard about Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain. As a very traumatic and formative story as well. But this is where we kind of catch up with what happens next. Isaac and his wife Rebekah find themselves going through the exact same thing that Abraham and Sarah went through. They're having a hard time starting a family. They're having a hard time having children. The people of God, you will find, it's a very interesting detail, are always challenged to be a people who know how to wait. Many of you who know have gone through seasons in your life, maybe literally seasons like this of infertility and waiting, but also other seasons of waiting. Is it at least an encouragement or at least interesting that every generation in the patriarchal narrative struggles with having children? Sarah, and then Rebekah, and then Jacob is going to marry a woman named Rachel who struggles. Every generation. It's as if the narrator, the story, the writer wants us to see the people of God are always challenged to be a people who know how to wait. And so here's what happens. There's hope in the story. Verse 21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. 2 things in the story. One is Isaac's prayer, and the second is Rebekah's question. Isaac's prayer is so interesting because this is exactly what his father did not do. Abraham took matters into his own hands, as we heard about in a sermon a few weeks ago, preached by Beth Moore, called The Trauma of Hagar. What happens with that story is, instead of going to God and saying, "What are you doing?" I'm interceding on behalf of my wife, my partner. Instead of doing that, Abraham takes matters into his own hands and creates a major familial trauma. Isaac shows us something pretty hopeful. Perhaps he's learned from his father's mistake. He goes to the Lord directly. It reminds me of this quote from Corrie ten Boom, the clockmaker turned freedom fighter in the Second World War, where she asks, "Is prayer your steering wheel or your spare tire?" Is prayer your steering wheel or your spare tire? For Abraham, it felt often like a spare tire, certainly early on in his story. For Isaac, there seems to be some generational growth. He goes directly to God with this prayer. But Rebekah does the same. An incredible even-handed picture. Rebekah goes directly to God with a question. The babies jostled within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Don't miss Jacob, the wrestler. We're going to talk a lot about that over the coming weeks at the end of this sermon series. Jacob and Esau are already wrestling, and there's something going on inside Rebekah, and she is worried. So all these years of waiting, and then finally it happens, but it doesn't mean the waiting's over. There's still questions within her. And notice she doesn't say, "What is happening to me?" It's not a what question, it's a why question. It's the deepest question of our heart. It's sometimes the unanswerable questions of our hearts. It's the reason the humanities are the greater science, because they ask the why question, not just the how question. All right, sorry. That was actually not in the notes. It's the eternal question. The eternal question. Why is this happening? And God does something incredible that he promises to do for us, but in a different way. He gives her a direct answer, and he gives her a prophetic, formative vision about who these two boys are going to be. And he says to Rebekah, directly, not through Isaac, directly to Rebekah, because God in the Genesis narrative speaks to men and women alike. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. It seems to me that the story of Jacob and Esau is kind of like this early Near Eastern dilemma, right? If you know anything about ancient Near Eastern honor culture, honor and shame and inheritance, it is the older the firstborn who always gets the inheritance, who inherits the family's wealth and status. And you can imagine when they discover the idea of twins, whenever this first happens in human history, someone in the ancient Near East goes, well, what do we do then? All right? What happens if you have 2 at the same time? It's like, well, in this story, there's kind of an answer, right? One comes out first. That Esau's the first one. Esau gets the birthright. But Jacob's unhappy with it, even as an infant, right? Jacob is not ready to let go of the idea of like, this is a real dilemma. We need to talk about this. Who's going to get the birthright? 2 nations are grappling for status within the womb of Rebekah, and this is a representation, I think, of an eternal question that people had about what do you do, and maybe some of you have asked this question in both good ways and bad, what happens when you have children or you know people who have children and they have the same upbringing and the same context and they turn out wildly different, right? Especially twins. The nature-nurture, they share genetic code in a way that other siblings don't. And so it feels to me, I'm not saying Jacob and Esau is a mythic story, but it asks some mythic questions, right? About why do people turn out the way they do? What are we to make of these 2 who are wrestling inside Rebekah? And then when they come out, it gets messier still, because we learn in verse 28, Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, the hunter. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, if you want a moral of the story, don't pick favorite kids, right? And that seems like a good one. All the parents in the room, look to your kids right now and assure them there are no favorites. You love them all equally but differently. That's what you're supposed to say, right? And then the one kid kind of asks inside their own little heart, like, how differently? Am I the most different? Just kidding. No, but there is this broken familial system, right? There's this thing happening where not only do we have Jacob and Esau turning against each other, we actually have Rebekah and Isaac not on the same page. And it begs this question. This is a little bit speculative. Did Rebekah not share the Lord's prophecy with her husband? Or did Isaac just choose to ignore it? Why is it that when he hears from the Lord, the older will serve the younger, i.e., Jacob is the one who's going to get the inheritance? Why would it be that Isaac says, well, Esau's my favorite? We don't know. Doesn't come out and tell us, but it at least begs those questions that I think if you're looking for a way into a passage, sometimes asking those open-ended questions can be really interesting. Is there something happening between Rebekah and Isaac where they're not communicating clearly? Or is it just that Isaac is holding on to the cultural expectations and normative things that he's been raised with? The firstborn gets the inheritance. The firstborn gets I don't know what that older serves the younger thing. It's a little ambiguous. If the Lord really wanted to be clear, he'd say Jacob's getting the inheritance. When Jacob came out, verse 26 said, his hand is grasping Esau's heel, and that's why they named him Jacob, because Jacob means to grasp. It can also mean heel. It can also mean deceiver. It does make you wonder what they were thinking when they named him, right? Right? A little bit. But I think the detail of what we're getting from this story is that something happened in the first appearance of these children that gave the parents an idea of who they thought they might be. Esau, red, hairy. We'll call him the name for red and hairy, Esau. Jacob, grasping the heel of his brother, not wanting to be left behind, we'll call him Jacob. And again, the Bible is full of these kind of moments that invite, I think, healthy, reverent speculation. What is going on between Jacob and Esau? What is going on between Isaac and Rebekah? And most importantly, what is going on in the heart and mind of Jacob? Again, here's what the story does not tell us. It does not tell us that Rebekah shared, at this point, the Lord's prophecy that the older will serve the younger. And yet we find a character in Jacob who is intent on getting that birthright, who's intent on grasping that heel. And what I want to really be careful about is holding up Jacob as the moral exemplar. Jacob is the character we should root for because he has such an intent, long view on God's promises that he doesn't want to let go. Because honestly, the way he treats Esau in this story is not great, right? The way he manipulates, the way he connives, the way he deceives. It'll get worse next week. Come back, we'll even go deeper into that question. But I really resist, and I read a lot of commentaries about this, the narrative that Jacob is held up as a moral exemplar and Esau is kind of held down as someone who just didn't care about their birthright. I think both of them have wrong views. But in our culture, we often celebrate the people who have the long view, even if it's a little bit wrong. I heard a story this week of someone who was going to meet with Steve Jobs because Apple was acquiring his company, and they had agreed for a set amount, and when he showed up, Steve Jobs said, I've changed my mind at the last minute, I'm offering you $100 million less. And the guy was dumbfounded, he was embarrassed. He said, well, I've flown all the way to California to see this. This is not right. And Steve Jobs goes, go back to your shareholders and tell them that we're not going to carry their ads on Apple anymore. So I'll sign the paper. And even the guy telling the story was sort of laughing, like, look at how impressive this is. I mean, I got played. And I was watching it kind of thinking to myself, like, there wasn't a contract, there was nothing legal, they had an agreement, he flew all the way across the country. And the comments on the Instagram post were really interesting, all just celebrating what a canny, cunning mind Steve Jobs was. What a great business aesthetic. And I'm not arguing that. But our culture, we sometimes celebrate those people, don't we? We like, even if we're a little bit worried that it might be questioning an ethical boundary, we're like, well, it's pretty impressive how they played it, right? And that's kind of, I think, how an ancient culture would have understood Jacob. They would have said, I'm not sure I feel comfortable with this, but man, he's pulling some moves. He's angling to be the first person in the history of the known Near Eastern world who got the inheritance despite being the secondborn. And the way he does it, does Jacob have the first monopoly? Right? Jacob having the stew, the thing that Esau needs the most, and withholding it until he receives that birthright. Jacob definitely has a long view, but I don't think it's the right view. It's just a long view. Esau, on the other hand, I think it's very fair to say, has a wrong view. Esau comes in, and this is the heart of the story. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, this is verse 31, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, quick, let me have some of that red stew, I'm famished. Excuse me. That is why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, first sell me your birthright. Look, I'm about to die, Esau said. What good is a birthright to me? Then Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. It's really, really interesting in the original language. The word stew shows up nowhere in the Hebrew. Nowhere in the Hebrew. When Esau runs in, he says, ha-adam, hazeh. That means, give me some of that red. Literally says the word twice. Scholars, people who commentate on this passage say he was in such a hurry. The narrator wants to give us a sense of the urgency. He forgot the noun. He just said red twice. I think that's a fine reading. I also think it's a reminder of not just his urgency, but also his name. Edom, that's what it's implying here, he came out and he was red, maybe red-haired. It's a little bit ambiguous. But he comes in from out being so famished that he's in such a hurry, he forgets the noun, right? And that kind of urgency, that being so tied in to our physical reality is one of the reasons that Esau has a wrong view, because he's willing to sell his spiritual and his social birthright. He's willing to let go of the promises of God because of his hunger. And some of you all know this. Some of you have some real hanger issues, all right? I'm not naming names, but some of you can be hungry for a little while and you're on a road trip and you can wait till the next stop. Some of you are like, if you don't pull over in 5 minutes, someone is dying. Right? I'm going to spare personal stories from my life for my own safety. But I will say, Esau's urgency is a spiritual problem. It's not just a physical problem. He's coming in from serving his family, from going out hunting. He has a sense of entitlement to that. And perhaps in some way inside his own heart, inside his own soul, he's justifying that urgency, justifying getting rid of his birthright because he's thinking, I'm going to die. Who would do this? And we have to ask again, who would do this? This is not a good brother, right? Providing meat and provision and supplies for the family to come in and to be withheld from the food. It's interesting that if you really reframe the passage this way, you see that Jacob and Esau have the same fatal flaw: impatience. Jacob is prophesied and promised to be the one that Esau will serve. And he's not waiting on the Lord to deliver the ways by which that's going to happen. He begins manipulating immediately. Esau, on the other hand, whether he knew the prophecy or not, is so ready to get rid of God's promise for his life that even a pang of hunger one time in his life is enough to sell out for that entire prophecy, that entire promise. The 17th century Anglican church leader Thomas Fuller, he says, it's kind of cynical, but the patient is not likely to recover who makes the doctor his heir, right? I think the point being that not just when money gets in the picture, but when we're not thinking about our future, when we're not planning for that future, we make all sorts of questionable decisions. And so what we see in the story of Jacob and Esau are two paradigmatic views of how we wait on the promises of God. One person says, I'm going to take the matter in my own hands. I'm going to be the author of my own fate. I'm going to wait for the moment when Esau's at his weakest, and I'm going to exploit and leverage that weakness to get what I want and what I think is promised for me. Esau, on the other hand, says, you know, I'm just ready to give it away at any moment. You might call this, if we're being a little bit simplistic, a generic secular and a generic religious view. What do I mean by that? Well, with Esau, there's a kind of, he's trying to serve the family, he's interested in the family's future. Perhaps he's been raised, I hope he's been raised, it seems he's been raised to believe in the promises of God, but he has a kind of cynical, skeptical view about it. Really, what's the value of a birthright? What's the value of inheriting this family's line, right? What's the value of being part of the Abrahamic legacy by which God promises to bless all people? He has this kind of cynical view, this kind of, I'll let it go. Jacob, on the other hand, has a generically religious view, and one that I'm not holding that up as a good example. I'm not saying it's religious in a good way. I'm saying that Jacob, in his own mind, is thinking, if the end is receiving the inheritance and the promises of God, it justifies any means. And let me be honest with you. That is the religious world we in the West are living in today. There are a lot of Christians, and a lot of you are the product of hurt in the church and around the church because you have seen how religious people and Christians can live in a world where they think that the end being good justifies any means to get there. Making people feel less than, going and screaming in people's faces or whatever it might be, as if it leads to change, then any mean is justified. Maybe you've heard the phrase that comes up quite a bit in our world that facts don't care about your feelings. Have you heard this? God cares about your feelings. The Lord cares about the means and the end. The Lord cares about what leads to that outcome as well as the outcome itself. And what we see with Jacob is, again, this generically religious view pretty cynical, saying, I want that promise. I want that inheritance. And whatever it takes for me to get there, so be it. Jacob and Esau, two paradigms of how we wait on God's promises. Let me give you one more example. Have you been following, this is a really dangerous subject because I feel like there's a lot of opinions out there. Have you been following generative AI and Chat GPT? I'm interested in it. A lot of strong opinions on this stuff. And I've been in all sorts of meetings and seminars and faculty meetings where it's the death of learning as we know it, right? I'm not sure I'm there. I'm also not welcoming it with open arms. There have been all sorts of stories in the world today about pastors who are writing their sermons using Chat GPT. There was one article in Christianity Today just last month that ran with this headline: I used Chat GPT for 6 months to help my pastoral ministry. Here's what worked. And then one church in Austin, very famously, just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, had an entire service, start to finish, all liturgy, generated by Chat GPT. Call to worship, prayers, everything. Some authors in the world today are really nervous and really upset because they feel like it's tantamount to plagiarism, because their work, their writing in the world today is it's animating the algorithm, right? There can't be Chat GPT unless writing is being drawn from somewhere, and that's being drawn from people who have not given their permission for it to be used for that. Okay, all this to give you a background. I know that's a lot. I think Esau would be a Chat GPT guy. Because the people that support generative AI, for better or for worse, people that support Chat GPT are saying, these algorithms will help us get more work done, it's more efficient, it will generate more information, and it will help us weed out misinformation using Chat GPT. I may be a little suspicious of that, but the idea that the goal of writing is information is wrong, in my opinion. The goal of writing is to wrestle. I tell my students this all the time. I tell my friends this all the time. The idea of an essay, the idea of writing something is not just to receive and pass on information. That is a very simplistic way to look at writing, and it's also a very simplistic way to look at the Bible. That this is just relaying moral information, we take it in. It's about wrestling with the ideas as readers and as writers. And when you hand that off to an algorithm, when you hand that off to a faceless, nameless, generative, artificial intelligence, you are no longer wrestling with ideas. Esau values information, expediency, and efficiency. Jacob, he may be cynical, but he's wrestling, and he will continue to wrestle with God, even though he's a broken person. That is the fundamental difference that I see in these two views, the long view and the wrong view. And neither of them are perfect, and that's why we need finally the view from the cross. Because what I'm trying to say is that when you look at the Bible as just getting a moral out of the story, you're going to come to passages like these, and you're going to be asking, what's the application? What's the information? One commentary I read said that the fact that Esau gives his birthright away so quickly is evidence that God made the right choice in choosing Jacob. I really disagree with that. The moral of this story is that God's decisions are not subject to our after-the-fact analysis. The fact of the matter is that they are both broken. And this is exactly what Paul says when we get to Romans 9. He turns to this moment in Scripture to explain the mysterious working of grace that we receive by virtue of Jesus Christ. He says this in Romans 9, 8, 10, something. I thought it was, let's actually go ahead to Romans 9, 10. Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac, yet before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose and election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told the older will serve the younger. Paul looks to this moment and says, no. God did not choose someone based on their work or what he knew they would do. He chose Jacob only because God is a God. The most we can say is that God is a God who loves to reverse and invert our expectations. He uses the powerless and the second-born to teach a lesson to us about where real power and real inheritance comes from. notice that Paul says something really interesting as he writes to people in Rome. He says, Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time. That our father Isaac, right? By our father Isaac. It's really important that Paul is writing to a group of Christians, many of whom are not Jewish by birth or descent, living in a very fraught culture in Rome and saying, we share the same father. You have been grafted into the family of God. And the grafting in is not a product of your own doing or your own behavior. And Paul, of all people, knows this. The problem with writing a commentary that says that God made the right choice by choosing Jacob, it doesn't explain why God would choose Paul, the person who tried to wipe out the church, who tried to murder new Christians. God doesn't choose people based on their works. He doesn't choose you or me based on our good behavior or reject us on our bad behavior. It is only through the cross that he chooses us at all. And that is a free invitation to all people in all times, because the view from the cross is the perfect synthesis of both a long view and an immediate view. Because once and for all at the cross, everything was settled. And yet, the narrative of grace marches on. And it reaches us today the same way it reached people in Rome in the first century. Anne Lamott puts it perfectly when she says, and I think this is kind of where I am often in my spiritual life, I do not at all understand the mystery of grace. Only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us. The mystery of grace is that it meets us wherever we are, not based on your past activity, not based on your past belief, not based on what you did this morning. It meets you exactly where you are, but it refuses to leave you where you are. And the difference between Jacob and Esau is someone who tries to take matters into their own hands and someone who tries to throw it away at the earliest opportunity. These are generic opportunities. These are polar responses to the eternal Christian challenge of waiting. The eternal challenge of waiting on the Lord's timing. Are you going to squeeze so tight that you interject or insert your own sinful patterns? Or are you going to let go so loosely that it's kind of treated like nothing that you value? In between the two, the view from the cross is one that radically has the power to change your perspective. Because Christ, when he went to that cross, when he was led outside the city walls, not out of a physical hunger, but out of a hunger to be in relationship with you and me, he knew that he would be and become the greater Jacob. The greater example of someone who is so fixed on the promises of God and yet willing to wait on his timing, willing not to take matters into his own hands. The night he was betrayed, he prayed to God, will you let me have some control here? Can this maybe pass? I don't want this to happen. And then finally arrives at a point where he says, not my will, but your will be done. The Garden of Gethsemane, in those tearful, prayerful moments, he does the thing that Jacob did not do, which is wait and hand his own life and will over to the Lord. That is the challenge that awaits us when we view life from the cross, allowing God to take control over our long view, but also aligning that view in the confidence that his promises will come to pass because of the mercy and grace of Jesus Christ. Let's pray. God, I do not understand the mystery of grace. It is a lifelong challenge and a struggle to understand the tension between accepting us where we are, finding us where we are, but also being pressed and moved beyond where we are, because grace refuses to leave us where it found us. When we partake in worship and when we partake in the meal that you instituted with your followers, may it be a reminder of the way that grace nourishes us. We are spiritually famished, and rather than give over our birthright, we feast on our birthright, your Son. Amen.